I grew up during a glorious time, the heyday of the action figure. The 1970s and 80s were the golden age for this pop culture icon, and during this time, action figures were designed exclusively as toys and were almost entirely marketed towards young boys. Prior to the 1960s, no one had ever heard the term action figure. However, by the time the 1980s came around, the boys' action figure market had become big business, and the culture of collecting action figures had evolved into a worldwide phenomenon. Classic action figures often represented pop culture personalities such as superheroes or movie, television and cartoon characters, or real-life heroes such as military figures and sports stars. Action figures gave children a scaled-down version of their favourite characters, with which they could act out their own adventures in living rooms, bedrooms and backyards. By the 1990s, the idea that action figures were only sold to young boys began to change with the advent of the adult action figure collector. By this time, many people who had grown up playing with action figures when they were children began collecting the vintage action figures they once had, as well as the new action figure products being offered in the retail outlets of the day. Toy companies took note of this trend, and by the 2000s, action figure consumption had almost entirely shifted from a kid's hobby to an adult's collectible obsession. In today's episode, Analog Toys takes a look back at the evolution of the modern action figure. From their early inception in the 1960s to the peak of their popularity in the 1980s, and onto today's multi-billion-dollar collectible action figure market that shows no signs of slowing down. Hello toy fans, my name is Tony and welcome to an Analog Toys special feature, the evolution of action figures. Prior to the 1960s, young boys predominantly played with three different types of toys. These included role-play toys such as cowboy outfits and toy military weapons, tinplate toys that represented everything from cars to spaceships, and finally toy soldiers. These key toy categories remain consistent within the boys' toy market from the turn of the century right through to the late 1950s, when the introduction of the most popular girls' toy ever imagined began to change the thinking of toy production companies. In 1959, the Mattel Toy Company introduced the now very famous Barbie doll, and this product became a massive success. Barbie dolls stood 11.5 inches tall and could be dressed in a wide variety of fashion outfits that were available in a number of different retail packs. With her multitude of accessories and idealised upscale lifestyle, Barbie quickly became an icon of female independence, an icon that resonated with young girls all over the globe. The popularity of Mattel's Barbie doll put the entire toy industry on high alert. Many companies wanted to recreate Barbie's success in the boys' toy market, but there was a catch. Back in the 1960s, it was never going to be easy to sell a doll to boys. Enter toy ideas man Stan Weston, who, in 1963, approached American toy manufacturing company Hasbro with his concept for a 12-inch tall soldier doll with removable uniforms. Hasbro's creative director Don Levine saw the potential in this idea, so Hasbro purchased the concept from Stan Weston for a flat $100,000 fee. Knowing that the parents of the 60s would never buy a doll for boys, Hasbro coined the term action figure and banned all employees, particularly salesmen, from ever referring to the product as a doll. The action figure that Hasbro created stood 12 inches tall and was articulated with 21 movable parts. Designed around a military theme, these action figures represented the United States Army, Air Force, Navy and Marines, and came with a wide variety of different uniforms and accessories. Hasbro named the first ever action figure G.I. Joe, and the toys were first released across America in 1964. The product was an undeniable hit with the boys of the day, and in a move that would create global popularity for this new action figure concept, Hasbro also licensed the product to companies in other international markets. Most notably, British toy company Palitoy, who renamed the brand and released it as Action Man in 1966. Sales of early G.I. Joe figures quickly reached the $200 million sales mark, and this left Stan Weston feeling that his $100,000 deal with Hasbro might not have been a good idea. So in 1965, Stan brought a similar idea to the Ideal Toys Corporation. This new concept also featured a 12-inch tall action figure with removable clothing, but this time kids will be able to dress the figure in a number of different superhero outfits.
Bold and brave, strong and true, speak the lightning from the blue. Captain Action.
Captain Action, so super powerful you can change him into 9 of the mightiest superheroes of all time. Change Captain Action's uniform and face mask and he's Batman, fighting crime with his batarang.
Fighting evil, that's his creed. Thundering power, lightning speed. Captain Action.
He's ideal.
The Captain Action range of action figures and outfits were incredibly well made, but sadly their commercial success was short-lived and the line was cancelled after only 2.5 years. Today, however, Captain Action products are fondly remembered and highly prized by vintage toy collectors. By the end of the decade, G.I. Joe's popularity was also beginning to wane, but this was due to the anti-war sentiment that spread across America as a reaction to the Vietnam War. The parents of the late 60s began boycotting all forms of war-themed toys, so Hasbro decided that G.I. Joe would evolve into an adventurer and quickly move away from his military roots. Around the same time, a then little-known toy company named Mego made its own attempt to break into the boys' action figure market with Action Jackson. This product was a cheaper and smaller plastic alternative to G.I. Joe, and it was met with a good degree of commercial success. But what really turned the Mego company into a major player in the action figure industry was the 1971 release of the world's greatest superheroes line. Securing the rights to both Marvel and DC comic book characters gave the Mego company a major foothold in the action figure market. This combination of clever licensing and low-cost products meant that kids were easily able to collect all their favourite superheroes, and the youth of the 1970s went absolutely crazy for this new brand of Mego action figure. The popularity of the world's greatest superheroes line may have turned Mego into one of the most prolific and dominant action figure manufacturers of the decade, but that didn't stop many other companies from producing their own action figure toy lines, many of which are considered classics today. In 1972, the Mattel Toy Company, which was still riding high on the continued success of Barbie, introduced their Big Jim line of action figures. The year 1974 saw the introduction of Gabriel's Western theme action figures based on the Lone Ranger. And the following year, Kenner released action figures inspired by the smash hit television show, The $6 Million Man. While in the United Kingdom, the popularity of Palitoy's Action Man continued to grow, and it would go on to become the best-selling boys' toy brand of the decade.
It's Big Jim's world of adventure. Big Jim's covering a rhino charge for TV when this rhino corners him next to a tree. So you set the trap on Big Jim's jungle truck. Release the net and change your luck. The jungle truck cage takes care of him. Because you don't fool around with old Big Jim. Big Jim Safari outfit, each sold separately. Big Jim jungle truck comes with rhino and net. From Mattel.
While these toy lines sold extremely well during the first half of the 1970s, things started to change due to the oil supply crisis, and action figure production companies began struggling with the manufacturing costs associated with making large plastic figures. So in 1974, Japan's Takara Toy Company introduced a 3 3/4-inch cyborg-themed action figure line called Microman. As the oil supply crisis continued, sales of larger action figures began to decline, and this led to many companies being forced to discontinue their once popular toy lines, including the industry's very first action figure, Hasbro's G.I. Joe. While Takara's range of Microman action figures sold well, this new 3 3/4-inch action figure scale would not become widely popular until 1977, and it was in this year that the entire boys' toy market changed forever. In fact, on May 31st, 1977 to be specific, the entire world changed when 20th Century Fox released a new movie entitled Star Wars. This fantasy space opera quickly became the highest grossing movie of all time, and the franchise would become a cultural phenomenon that spread across the entire globe. The world of Star Wars was filled to the brim with strange and exciting characters, bizarre creatures, alien planets, and amazing spaceships. The concept was perfectly suited for development into an action figure toy line. But when the film's director George Lucas was shopping around the toy rights 1 year before the movie was released, no one had predicted its commercial success. In the most regrettable decision the toy industry has ever known, toy companies Hasbro, Mattel and Mego all passed on the opportunity to produce Star Wars toys, believing the movie to be nothing more than another flash-in-the-pan sci-fi adventure. But it wasn't. The success of Star Wars caught everybody off guard, including Kenner, the company that had secured the rights to produce action figures based on this exciting new film, so the company scrambled to get products out as quickly as possible. In the late 1970s, however, developing an action figure toy line was a slow process. Kenner was never going to be able to get action figures into toy stores by Christmas 1977, so the company decided to sell kids an empty box. Yes, an empty cardboard box. This box was known as the Star Wars Early Bird Certificate Package, and it featured a painted backdrop and a certificate to send away for the first 4 action figures that would be shipped to customers in the first half of 1978. Crucially, these new Star Wars action figures would be produced in a 3 3/4 inch scale with 5 points of articulation at the neck, shoulders and hips. This made them very low cost, and the children of the day could easily start collecting all their favourite characters. But, more importantly, this smaller scale meant that Kenner was also able to manufacture toy versions of X-Wings and TIE Fighters, and of course, the Millennium Falcon. If Kenner had opted to use a larger scale for its action figures, it would have meant that the vehicles and playsets would be far too costly to manufacture, and it was this smaller scale that was the key ingredient in turning the Star Wars toy line into one of the biggest successes in the industry. These toys exploded onto the market with a popularity unlike anything seen before, and the 3 3/4 inch scale quickly became the new industry standard for boys' action figures.
Kenner presents new alien action figure.
Bayman's flow! Quick, shut the airlock! The alien's locked out now! He got through! Shh! Give up! Alien can't be beat! We'll zap him with the light! Don't, he'll destroy the spaceship! We've lost! Better find another ship! Let's try the kitchen! Another triumph for Alien!
Alien action figure, new from Kenner.
Hasbro, wanting to revive its now defunct G.I. Joe toy line, shrunk the figures down to the Star Wars scale of 3 3/4 inches. But seeing posability as one of the brand's key successes in its early years, the company designed their new G.I. Joe figures with far more articulation than the Kenner Star Wars figures. Now rebranded as G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, the Hasbro action figures had articulation at the neck, shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, and eventually biceps. And to help kids get really invested in the new characters, Hasbro also teamed up with Marvel writer Larry Hama, who went on to author one of the most popular comic books of the 1980s. While the Star Wars range of action figures may have ruled the toy stores in the late 70s and early 80s, it was this rebranded G.I. Joe concept that dominated the majority of the decade. This new 3 3/4 inch action figure scale was so popular that many other toy lines followed suit, including Indiana Jones, Palitoy's Action Force, the A-Team, and a slew of others. But there were 2 other 80s action figure lines that, alongside G.I. Joe, easily stood as the most popular of the decade, and those were Mattel's Masters of the Universe and Hasbro's Transformers. The Masters of the Universe action figure line was the first time a toy company opted for a larger scale for their figures, since the inception and runaway success of the 3 3/4 inch scale Star Wars line. Inspired by a unique sci-fi fantasy mythology, this new action figure range stood 5 inches tall and featured overly muscular sculpted designs, and each individual figure came with an action feature gimmick. While initially very popular, this toy line really achieved its phenomenal global success with the introduction of the animated cartoon produced by Filmation. Hasbro, on the other hand, had not developed the Transformers concept. They actually found the toys at a Tokyo toy fair and brought them to the United States under license. These action figures were an evolution in the truest sense of the word. Representing futuristic robot characters, the figures could actually transform into vehicles and other real-world devices. And this was the real genius behind the concept. Transformers was another brand whose popularity was bolstered by an accompanying cartoon. And while many people are aware that I'm not a fan of the Transformers storyline, I do admire the toys, and I really can appreciate the engineering design that went into each product.
Mask, where illusion is the ultimate weapon.
Convert Switchblade to jet mode. Surprise, Matt Tracker. It's mayhem. Battle station. Protect the decoder, Bruce. I'm going up. Stacks ready to fire.
Mask, Switchblade, Thunderhawk, and Rhino.
Fire!
Each sold separately with action figure.
Cover me, Matt. 10-4. Sato's getting away. But you're not, Mayhem.
Mask, Switchblade, Thunderhawk, and Rhino. Each sold separately. New from Kenner.
This combination of action figure toy line and accompanying cartoon became a trend that would go on to define the boys' toy market of the 1980s. As the popularity of action figures reached its peak, the decade saw an almost countless range of different action figure lines produced in varying scales, including Rambo and the A-Team, the Real Ghostbusters and Bravestar, Centurions and Thundercats, and Kenner's Superpowers and Mask lines. But the toy line that would take us out of the 80s and into the 90s was based on the bonkers cartoon Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I consider the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles toy line to be the last line that was ever exclusively produced for children, because as we entered the 1990s, legions of adult action figure collectors started popping up all over the globe. In my opinion, two different toy lines really helped to encourage the early onset of the adult action figure collecting craze, and these were McFarlane's Spawn line, which was clearly marketed towards the adult collector, and the reintroduction of Star Wars action figures. Kenner's original range of Star Wars action figures died out in 1985 due to the fact that no more Star Wars movies were being released at the time. But when Kenner produced a new line of figures in 1995, the kids who had grown up playing with these toys in the late 70s and early 80s were now adults, and they were desperate to recapture some of that childhood toy wonder, and they began collecting the figures on an unprecedented scale. By the dawn of the new millennium, the typical action figure consumer had almost entirely changed from children to adults, and companies like Sideshow and Hot Toys began manufacturing high-end, photorealistic action figures exclusively for the adult collectible market. And today, business is booming. Sadly though, it seems today that fewer and fewer children are collecting action figures, and I think that's a real shame. One of the reasons I called my channel Analog Toys is because I grew up in an age that was devoid of digital technology. However, I have a 12-year-old son, and as hard as I've tried to influence him, he's just never been interested in action figures. He's more interested in iPods and PlayStations. There is hope though. Recently, a lovely mother from Kent County in England contacted me, wanting to purchase a couple of DVD copies of my Story of Action Man documentary for her sons. In my naivety, I automatically assumed her sons would be around my age. I mean, who else would be interested in a now defunct toy line like Action Man? Well, it turns out I was completely wrong, and this lady's sons are actually aged 7 and 8 years old, and they're absolutely crazy about Action Man. And they even have a few vintage ones in their collection that have been handed down from fathers and uncles. So here is a massive shout out to Arthur and Rufus, two English boys who are keeping the action figure dream alive. And if you boys live by Action Man's morals of being a hero for good, I'm sure Santa will take care of you this Christmas. So that's all for this episode. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.